Adila lives in a dusty, lower-middle-class town called Luleka in East Africa. Life there is tough, and every day feels like a test of strength. She wakes up before the sun rises, carrying heavy water containers from the well, sweeping the compound, cooking for the household, and fixing old torn clothes with a needle and thread. Her hands are always busy, her eyes always focused. Her late mother had been a seamstress and passed down her sewing skills. Even though she has very little, Adila holds on to one quiet dream: to become a fashion designer one day. Her world may be small, but her hopes reach far beyond the dusty roads of Luleka. Everything in Adila's life changed the day her mother, Mwanza, passed away. It happened suddenly, without warning. One day, her mother had a small fever, and by the next, she was gone. The house, once filled with warmth, laughter, and the soft sounds of sewing and stories, turned cold and silent. Adila didn't understand how quickly the light in her world had disappeared. Her mother was not just a parent. She was her teacher, her friend, her protector. With her gone, Adila felt like the ground had been pulled from under her feet. Her father changed too. The man who once smiled at her small stitches and brought home fabric scraps for her to practice on, now sat quietly in the corner of the house, barely speaking, barely eating. Grief made him hollow. He stopped noticing things. He didn't see how sad Adila was, how lonely she felt, or how empty the home had become. He was lost in his own pain, and in that silence, something dark crept in. Only a few weeks after Mwanza's funeral, a woman appeared in their home. Her name was Jabina. She was well dressed with perfect makeup and spoke in a tone that was too sweet to be sincere. She told the neighbors that Adila's father had asked her to help with the house, that she was now part of the family, but it didn't feel like family. Jabina's smile never reached her eyes, and her eyes always followed everything in the house, especially the things Mwanza had left behind. Jabina wasted no time. She moved in fully within days, bringing with her flashy clothes, strong perfumes, and a controlling attitude. The little bits of peace that remained in the house vanished as soon as she took charge. She threw out Adila's mother's old sewing basket, claiming it was clutter. She began rearranging furniture, hiding family photos, and replacing anything that reminded the house of Mwanza. Adila tried to hold on to little things, a handkerchief, an old dress, but even those slowly disappeared. Adila's father didn't question any of it. He sat in silence, letting Jabina take over everything. It was like he had disappeared without leaving the house. Adila watched as her home became unfamiliar, as her routine became controlled, and as the warmth of her past faded completely. Jabina didn't speak kindly to her. She gave orders, made remarks about her looks, her silence, her useless sewing skills. But worst of all, she never called her by her name. To Jabina, she was just that girl. It didn't take long before Adila's chores doubled. She was now the one who did all the cleaning, cooking, and washing. She wasn't allowed to go out much, wasn't allowed to play, and definitely wasn't allowed to sew unless it was for house repairs. Jabina watched her with cold eyes, always waiting for her to mess up. The home that once echoed with her mother's singing now only echoed with commands, complaints, and silence. Every night, Adila cried quietly into her pillow, missing her mother's touch, her stories, her protection. She held on to her memories like treasure, the only warmth left in a house that had turned into a prison. And though no one else saw it, deep down, she knew. Jabina wasn't there to help. She was there to take. And Adila, she was just in the way. Days turned into weeks, and the sadness in the house began to take a different shape. Jabina, who had once entered with a fake smile and sweet voice, started to show her real face. It began with small things, telling Adila to sweep again even if she had just cleaned, making her redo meals for no reason, or acting like her presence was a problem. Then, things became more serious. One morning, Adila got ready for school like she always did, putting on her old, faded uniform. But Jabina stopped her at the door and said, "You won't be needing that anymore." She didn't explain, and Adila's father didn't say a word. From that day, her schooling was over. Adila was confused and heartbroken. School had been her only escape, the one place where she could forget her pain for a little while, where she could smile with friends, draw dress designs in the back of her notebooks, and feel like a regular girl. But Jabina didn't care. Education, in her eyes, was a waste for someone like Adila. Instead, she gave her a broom and a long list of chores. That became her new daily routine. Jabina also started taking away Adila's personal belongings, her clothes, her books, the tiny pieces of fabric she used to practice sewing. Everything began to vanish, one by one. She asked Jabina about her things, but was only met with sharp eyes and mocking words like, "You won't need those in your new life." Even the photo of her mother, the one she had hidden under her mattress, disappeared. Adila felt like she was being erased from her own life. Each day began before sunrise and ended late at night. She was now the one who cleaned every room, cooked every meal, fetched water, washed clothes, and even cleaned Jabina's shoes. No one said thank you. If anything went wrong, she was shouted at. If something was missing, she was blamed. She wasn't allowed to sit on the sofa, wasn't allowed to eat at the table, and sometimes wasn't even allowed to eat at all. She had become a ghost in her own home, a servant who wasn't paid, praised, or even seen. Her father, the one person she still hoped might protect her, said nothing. He watched it all happen with tired, empty eyes. He didn't ask why she wasn't going to school, didn't ask why she looked thinner, didn't even ask why she was always working. Maybe he didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. Maybe Jabina's fake comfort and controlling ways had covered his heart with fog. Whatever the reason, he remained silent, and that silence felt louder than any words. Adila stopped complaining. There was no one to listen. She learned to work with her head down and her tears hidden, but inside, she was breaking. She missed her mother's voice, her soft touch, and her way of turning even sad days into stories. Now, all she had were long days, heavy chores, and the feeling that she didn't belong in her own home. The house felt bigger than before, but it wasn't because it had changed. It was because Adila had been pushed into the corners. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a child. To Jabina, she was just extra hands. To her father, she was a shadow. And to herself, she was starting to feel invisible. But even in that darkness, somewhere deep in her heart, a tiny spark still remained. A small, quiet hope that maybe one day someone would see her again. One morning, while Adila was scrubbing the front steps, she overheard voices buzzing with excitement. The town was filled with talk about an extravagant wedding. Jabina's cousin, Lomo, was getting married to someone from a rich, well-known family. It wasn't just any event. It was the most talked-about celebration in the entire region. Important people would be attending, and everyone wanted to look their best. It was all over the market stalls, from the butchers to the tailors. The streets began to sparkle with colourful banners and loud music. As soon as the invitation arrived at their house, Jabina's energy shifted completely. Her eyes lit up with ambition. She paced the floor, whispering about who she would meet, how she had to be noticed, and how she would make an unforgettable entrance. It wasn't about celebrating love. It was about showing off. She became obsessed with her appearance. Every mirror in the house became her best friend. She spent hours inspecting her face, her figure, imagining herself among the guests, the cameras flashing. Her hunger for admiration grew stronger every day. But instead of going to a tailor or buying a ready-made gown like the other women, she turned to Adila. One night after dinner, she stood in front of her with a cold smile and said, "You will sew me a dress no one can forget. I want people to stare when I walk in. I want their mouths to drop, make them jealous." Her voice wasn't asking, it was commanding. She called it a test, a chance for Adila to prove her worth. But there was no kindness in her tone. The next morning, she tossed a bundle of cheap, crumpled fabric on the floor. The material was rough, faded, and full of small holes. Along with it, she gave Adila a handful of dull needles, broken threads, and nothing else. No sewing machine, no patterns, not even scissors. "Use what you have," she said coldly. "If you fail, you'll regret it." Her eyes held a warning, not just words. Adila stared at the fabric in silence. It was barely enough to make a blouse, let alone an entire gown. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't argue. She knew better. Every stitch, every fold, every mistake would be used against her. Jabina wanted a masterpiece from scraps, a miracle without tools. It wasn't a request, it was a trap. Still, Adila picked up the fabric and took it to her corner, the one near the kitchen window where she usually patched old shirts. The pressure on her was crushing. Jabina checked on her constantly, yelling whenever she thought progress was slow. She wanted a dress that shimmered, that hugged perfectly, that made every other woman at the wedding feel small. Yet she gave Adila nothing to work with but time, fear, and scraps. And even time wasn't much. She had only 5 days. Adila worked through the nights, skipping meals, ignoring her aching back and bleeding fingers. She stitched by candlelight with only memory and instinct guiding her. Every time she looked at the poor quality fabric, she imagined what her mother would have done. She remembered the patterns, the folds, the tricks her mother taught her in whispers. With every thread she pulled, she sewed in her pain, her dreams, her silent strength. Meanwhile, Jabina paraded through the house with her head high, talking about the grand party, who would be there, and how she'd turn heads. She never once asked how Adila was managing. She never offered help or kindness. All she cared about was the dress and the attention it would bring her. Adila said nothing. She just kept sewing, letting her silence carry the weight of every word she wanted to scream. The wedding was only days away, and her hands had to create magic from nothing. Because failure wasn't an option, not in a house where punishment waited in every shadow. The small sewing room, once a quiet space for Adila's dreams, turned into her cage. She was not allowed to leave unless called. A thin mat on the cold floor became her bed. The air was heavy with the smell of dust, and the only light came from an old bulb that flickered like it might go out at any moment. Jabina locked the door behind her each night, tossing in stale bread or a leftover crust if she remembered. There were no blankets, no comfort, just silence, and the pressure of creating something perfect from nothing. Adila's fingers trembled as she picked up the broken needles. Her hands already carried blisters from days of scrubbing floors, and now the endless hours of stitching made them worse. The cheap thread snapped often, and the dull needles pierced her skin more than the fabric. Blood stained her thumbs, but she wrapped them with old cloth and kept going. She couldn't afford to stop, not even to cry. The bulb above her buzzed softly, casting shaky shadows on the wall. It was the only thing that kept her company during the dark hours. Outside, she could hear laughter from Jabina's room, loud music from the neighbor's radio, and sometimes the soft voices of women talking about their dresses for the wedding. None of that belonged to her world anymore. Her world was this corner, this task, this pain. Jabina came in often, standing over her like a hawk. She never offered help, only criticism. Too slow, she'd hiss. Too plain. Once, she snatched the fabric from Adila's lap, shouting that the folds were wrong and that she'd ruin everything. Then she threw it back and slammed the door. Adila blinked away her tears, picked up her needle again, and started over. She didn't sleep much. Her body ached for rest, but her mind wouldn't stop. She thought about her mother, about how her hands used to move gently over cloth, turning even scraps into beauty. Adila remembered her smile, her soft advice, and how she used to hum while sewing. Those memories became her strength. She began to imagine her mother's hands guiding her own, helping her create what felt impossible. The fabric was rough, but she handled it with care. She smoothed it, pressed it with her palms, shaped it into something that slowly began to resemble a dress. She cut, folded, and stitched with precision. Each thread she pulled carried a part of her soul. She didn't have proper tools, but she had vision. With each layer added, the gown took shape, soft lavender shining under the weak light. Adila worked through hunger, past pain, beyond exhaustion. Her nails broke, her skin cracked, and her legs felt numb from sitting too long. But she didn't stop. She gathered tiny fake pearls from a broken necklace she found in the trash and sewed them by hand along the collar and sleeves. Her fingertips throbbed, but the pearls sparkled like real gems. By the 5th night, the dress was almost done. It stood hanging from a nail on the wall, swaying gently in the still air. The satin, though old, looked smooth and elegant. The pearls added a touch of softness. The folds fell just right, hugging the shape of an invisible body. Adila stepped back and looked at it, her chest tight with pride and fear. She didn't know if Jabina would love it or tear it apart, but she knew one thing. She had given it everything. In the silence of the room, surrounded by thread scraps and blood-stained cloths, the dress glowed like hope. Adila had turned cruelty into creation, using hands that had only known pain. The gown stood as proof that even in darkness, something beautiful could be born. After days of pain, hunger, and endless stitching, the dress was finally complete. Adila carefully laid it across the wooden table, smoothing every seam, admiring the result of her silent fight. The soft lavender fabric shimmered gently under the dim light, and the small pearls sparkled like stars in a purple sky. The gown was more than clothing. It was proof she had endured everything without breaking. Her body ached, her fingers were sore, but her heart held a quiet sense of pride. She sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, staring at her work with heavy eyes. The silence in the room wrapped around her like a blanket. Without meaning to, she drifted into sleep, her head resting on her arm, the dress only a few steps away. There were no dreams that night, just stillness. Morning arrived with chaos. A sharp scream shattered the silence. Jabina's heels clicked fast across the floor, followed by a loud bang as the door flew open. Adila jumped awake, heart racing. Jabina's face twisted with rage as she held up the dress, now ruined. The lavender satin was covered in dark stains. The bottom hem was ripped, the stitching pulled loose, and the delicate pearlwork had fallen apart. The dress looked like it had been dragged through mud and ripped by claws. Adila's hands shook. She stood slowly, staring in disbelief. It had been perfect when she closed her eyes. She had placed it safely, untouched. She hadn't even moved in her sleep. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't do this." But Jabina was already shouting, "You did this out of spite, out of jealousy. You hated that I would shine, so you destroyed it." Adila's heart sank. No words could convince her otherwise. Jabina wasn't listening. Her anger wasn't just about the ruined gown. It was about humiliation. She cared more about her reputation than the truth. The wedding was hours away, and the dress she had bragged about was in pieces. She needed someone to blame, and Adila was the easiest target. Adila tried to explain. She pointed to her thread box, still closed. She showed her tired hands, her tear-filled eyes. But Jabina only saw betrayal. She shouted louder, accusing her of being ungrateful, calling her names that cut deeper than any wound. She paced the room, holding the dress like a dead dream, then dropped it on the floor as if it had never mattered. Adila stood frozen. Inside her, something broke, not because of the dress, but because after everything, every painful stitch, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, this was the reward. Her effort had been turned into blame. Her work had been destroyed, and her voice didn't matter. The ruined dress sat there like a cruel joke. No one asked how it happened. No one questioned if someone else had done it. Jabina didn't wonder if her anger had enemies. She didn't care about justice, only appearance. Adila was the easy answer, the silent servant with no one to defend her. And in that moment, as she stood in the middle of the wreckage, Adila realized something painful. No matter how much beauty she created, no matter how much pain she endured, she would always be seen as the problem. The dress was just fabric, but to her, it had been hope, and now, even that was gone. The morning sun hadn't even risen fully when loud shouting echoed through the neighborhood. Doors creaked open, curtains were pushed aside, and curious faces peeked out. In the center of the courtyard stood Jabina, her eyes wild, her voice like fire. She had Adila by the arm, dragging her like a rag doll. The girl's feet barely kept up, and her face showed more shock than fear. The torn gown trailed behind them, held high in Jabina's other hand like a flag of disgrace. "She ruined everything!" Jabina cried out, her voice shaking with rage. "This worthless girl destroyed my dress, on purpose, out of spite. She's jealous of me." Gasps came from some of the women nearby, but no one dared speak. People watched in silence, unsure what to believe, but too scared of Jabina's sharp tongue and louder pride. She stood in the middle of the yard, spinning her story like a storm, her face red and her hair wild. She pointed at Adila, who stood still, her hands trembling, lips pressed tightly to keep her tears hidden. "She waited until I slept, then crept in and ruined the whole gown," Jabina continued, her voice full of venom. "Just to shame me, just to make me look like a fool." Then, as if that wasn't enough, her anger turned crueler. She spit words that sliced deeper than knives. "Just like her mother, a nobody seamstress who died with nothing to her name," she shouted. "I should have known her daughter would be cursed." Adila's head dropped. The mention of her mother's name, twisted with insult, hit her harder than anything else. Her mother's memory was sacred to her. She had worked hard, loved deeply, and died too soon. To hear her name smeared in front of strangers was unbearable. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A few murmured softly, but no one dared to challenge Jabina. Her reputation, her sharp tongue, her husband's silence, they were enough to keep the whole street quiet. No one stepped forward. No one defended Adila. They just watched as a child was accused, insulted, and disgraced in public. Jabina didn't want the truth. She didn't even want answers. What she wanted was revenge. She needed someone to feel her disappointment, someone to carry her shame. And Adila, small, voiceless, and alone, was the perfect target. The courtyard fell silent for a moment after Jabina's last insult. Adila stood quietly, her eyes empty, her hands hanging at her sides. The ruined dress lay on the ground beside her, the morning breeze lifting its torn edges. Everyone watched, frozen, not knowing what would come next. Then, in a sudden burst of fury, Jabina stormed back into the house. No one moved. Adila didn't even flinch. Moments later, she returned holding a long kitchen knife. The blade gleamed in the sunlight. A few people gasped. One of the older women near the gate whispered, "What is she doing?" Without a word, Jabina grabbed Adila's wrist, the same hand that had stitched her dress night after night, and forced it onto a wooden stool. Adila's body tensed, but she didn't scream. Her eyes widened with fear, but she didn't move. Jabina's face was wild, twisted with rage and pride, and before anyone could step forward, before anyone could stop her, the knife came down. A single, sharp motion, a sound, dull, final, sickening, cut through the air. Adila's index finger dropped to the ground. For a second, no one breathed. Then came the screams. Blood flowed from Adila's hand, dark and fast, soaking her clothes and dripping onto the dirt. Her knees buckled, and she fell back, clutching her hand with shaking fingers. Her mouth opened in shock, but no sound came out. A neighbor covered her mouth. Another screamed for help. Someone fainted near the entrance. The world had turned upside down in a blink. The knife dropped with a thud. Jabina stood there, panting, her face pale but still proud, as if she believed she had done something right. "That's what she deserved!" she shouted. "Let her sew now! Let her try to ruin anyone else's life!" But her words no longer mattered. Two women rushed to Adila's side, one wrapping a scarf tightly around her bleeding hand, the other yelling for someone to call the police. A man ran to the nearest shop to borrow a phone. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Jabina tried to walk away, but hands reached out to stop her. The neighbors who had been afraid now found courage. The sight of a child's blood had broken their silence. When the police arrived, they didn't ask many questions. They saw the knife. They saw Adila's hand. They saw the crowd. Jabina started shouting that she was innocent, that people were lying, that Adila had hurt herself, but no one believed her anymore. She was handcuffed in front of the same neighbors she once controlled. As the officers pulled her toward the car, she kept yelling, "I'm being framed! This is a setup!" But her words floated into the air, unheard and unwanted. Adila, still on the ground, was carried away gently by two women, her hand wrapped tight, her eyes still wide with shock. Blood marked the place where she once stood, a silent witness to cruelty finally exposed. Adila was rushed to the hospital, unconscious and pale, her hand wrapped in layers of blood-soaked cloth. The nurses moved fast, and the doctors did everything they could. They managed to stop the bleeding, but the finger could not be saved. It was gone forever. The pain was unbearable, but what hurt more was the silence that had allowed things to go this far. As Adila lay in the hospital bed, a young police officer named Nwoko visited her. He had heard the details from the neighbors, and the scene he saw at the courtyard had haunted him. His heart broke seeing Adila's small hand, bandaged and trembling. He promised her justice, not just words, but real action. He opened a case against Jabina, charging her with abuse, assault, and causing permanent injury to a minor. The villagers, who had once stayed quiet in fear, now stepped forward. They gave statements, shared what they saw, and admitted how long they had noticed Jabina's cruel treatment but didn't speak up. Now they regretted their silence. News spread like wildfire. A local journalist wrote an article with the headline, "Girl's finger cut off for sewing too well." It went viral overnight. Social media picked it up, and soon women's rights groups across the country were speaking up. People were shocked, angry, and heartbroken. They demanded justice for Adila and protection for girls like her. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Jabina stood in silence, no longer proud, her beauty fading behind stress and shame. Adila sat quietly with a scarf covering her injured hand, her eyes tired but strong. The judge listened to the testimonies, the medical reports, the police files, and the voices of those who had witnessed it all. The verdict was clear: guilty. Jabina was sentenced to 6 years in prison for her crimes. The courtroom erupted in relief. Adila didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: seen. Back in the village, people couldn't stop talking about it. Posters about child protection were put up. Women whispered apologies to Adila whenever they passed her. The girl who had once been invisible was now a symbol of strength. Justice had come late, but it had come loud. After weeks in the hospital, Adila finally returned home. Her hand still bandaged, but healing. The pain lingered, especially at night, but something deeper had changed. She felt stronger. People from the village began to visit, many bringing small gifts, fabrics, or words of encouragement. Some women who once looked the other way now came with sewing supplies, quietly offering support and respect. Adila didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for thread, cloth, and time. With the help of local women's groups and donations from those touched by her story, she set up a small sewing corner outside her home. Using her mother's old sewing machine and a handmade wooden table, she opened her little shop and named it Finger and Thread. The name carried a story, a reminder of what was taken from her and what she rebuilt. She started by repairing neighbors' clothes. Word spread quickly. Soon, people were requesting custom pieces, school uniforms, wedding dresses, and everyday wear. Her work was delicate, detailed, and full of care. Every stitch showed her love for the craft, and every customer left with more than just a finished outfit. They left with admiration. As her confidence grew, so did her dream. Adila saved every coin she earned, and soon she bought more sewing machines. But she didn't use them for profit. Instead, she welcomed other girls who came from troubled homes, offering to teach them. She told them gently, "This needle can make more than clothes. It can make a new life." Her yard turned into a lively workspace, full of color, stories, and laughter. Girls stitched side by side, learning not only how to sew, but how to believe in themselves again. Her story was shared in markets, across town, and even online. One wedding dress she designed was photographed and went viral, bringing more attention to her tiny but growing shop. People traveled to meet her, not to talk about what happened to her, but what she had done with it. She became a symbol of strength, dignity, and hope, stitched from brokenness. Adila had turned pain into purpose, and silence into success. She was no longer the girl who was hurt. She was the woman who healed and helped others heal too.